This is hell.
Art and money have had a long and sordid relationship, and arguably art and capitalism need each other to survive. So what can we do to challenge the system in an era of art after money and money after art? Here to tell us, organizer and educator Max Haiven is author of Art After Money, Money After Art, Creative Strategies Against Financialization. Welcome back to This Is Hell, Max.
It's great to be back.
Max has been on our show a couple of times in the past. One time he was on to talk about, undercommoning. Another time he was on to talk about reactionary authoritarianism. That was back in 2016 and 2017. You can find all those interviews at our website, thisishell.com. And you can follow Max on Twitter at Max Haiven. That's Haiven. And go to his website at maxhaiven.com. You write money and art as they exist under capitalism must be abolished along with that economic system. What is wrong with art under capitalism? What does capitalism do to art that makes art wrong?
Well, I think there's two aspects to that question, or two answers that I'd give you. The first is that I think especially over the last 20 or 30 years of capitalism, and it's what we call the financialized phase, where finance, capital, and speculative money has risen to prominence in the capitalist economy. Art itself has become financialized. So now there are a lot of firms and a lot of companies and a lot of individuals who are very interested in using art as a speculative asset, something that you invest in to get a higher return later, with very little concern for its aesthetic value, for its contribution to culture and society. So on the one hand, art, like everything else in our society, has been turned into sort of the plaything of the plutocrats. But I think in this book, I'm trying to say that there's a deeper problem here, too, which is that under capitalism, the fundamental sort of what we would talk about as a creative or imaginative impulse of our species has really been progressively reoriented towards the generation of profit and towards corporate power. So art, on the one hand, is like those expensive objects we see in big museums. Those have become financial assets, but at a much more profound level, even on the level of daily life for most of us who don't consider ourselves artists, our artistic impulse and our artistic skills and talents and passions have also been commodified, financialized, and instrumentalized.
So, is that financialization of art new? Because I am certain that I'm going to get an email from somebody who says, this is no different than when the de Medicis or the Borgias or the Catholic Church were the biggest art patrons in the world. So how is the financialization of art anything new, anything different from what it was in the past? Hasn't it always reflected what the people who have the most money want?
Yes, absolutely. As long as there's been a thing we call art, which is actually a very recent human invention as a term. I mean, the creative impulse has, of course, been with us since we evolved into what we now understand to be humans. But ever since there's been this distinct category that we call art, that usually we associate with sort of romantic men drinking themselves to death in Paris, that has always been a plaything of the ruling class. But what has changed is that the ruling class has changed. So, of course, in medieval and Renaissance Italy, as you mentioned, that ruling class was a very tight group of religious and economic and political elites who wanted art to do certain things for them. Specifically, they wanted it to glorify their worldview. They wanted it to tell a story about how their rule over the rest of society was legitimate, and they wanted it to ornament their mansions and houses that they had bought with their sort of ill-begotten wealth. Well, that hasn't changed fundamentally. That is still what the ruling class today wants, but the ruling class is very different today than it was in Renaissance Italy. Today, the ruling class is globalized. They make money not necessarily through sort of mercantilist mechanisms or through exploiting peasantry, although that is still part of the capitalist system. They increasingly make money through speculation and through extraction and through the exploitation of labor. And so this ruling class is much more global. It's much more cosmopolitan in its tastes and its desires. And what it wants from art is very different. They're not as interested in sort of conservative depictions of how wonderful the world is under their care. They're actually more interested in provocative art. They're interested in edgy art. They're interested in art that pushes boundaries because, in fact, that's what the ruling class today thinks they are doing. the financiers of Wall Street or the City of London or Shanghai or Frankfurt, they believe that, like artists, they're bringing their creativity into the world and manifesting their will as, this sort of image of the romantic artist we have. And of course, the difference is that an artist, if they make some mistake, you get a kind of ugly canvas. When these capitalists make a mistake, you get global warming, nuclear war, and, reactionary authoritarian governments.
Under neoliberalism, we have this celebration of the individual and this dismissal, if not derision, of anything that is a collective notion or a collective response to anything. How much is the ruling class today, under neoliberalism, under financialization, under the state of capitalism that we are currently living in, how much is the ruling class today more individualized and not thinking in more of a collective nature, and that because of neoliberalism, and that leads to them making decisions that are different from their predecessors who were the economic elites of capitalism at their time?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think to a very large extent today's ruling class is defined by their access to money rather than as it was in the past, their family connections and their kind of class unity. And that leads to a number of deeply morbid systems within the capitalist system. One of them is that they don't often realize that one of the central contradictions of capitalism is that though in order to move forward, in order to accumulate wealth in the hands of capitalists, capitalists must compete with one another. That is a fundamental feature of the system. At various times, they have to cooperate, and those times are typically when there's an economic crisis. And for instance, as J.P. Morgan did, almost 100 years ago now, literally called together the biggest financiers in New York City and insisted that they all make a collective sacrifice for the good of their class, or else there would be a massive economic crisis, as there was a little later in the Great Depression, in the Great Crash that led to the Great Depression. But that if they didn't make this sacrifice together for their common good, the system would crash and the masses would rise up. And that's kind of a part of the defense mechanism of capitalism. But today's capitalists are both so globalized and so individualist in their understanding, they can't even necessarily figure out how to take that kind of class leadership. And for the rest of us, that's both a good thing and a bad thing. It's a good thing because if they can't take leadership and they can't cooperate, it would make it easier for social movements of the non-ruling class to challenge their power and make a more egalitarian, equal, and peaceful society. Unfortunately, in the absence of massive social movements that could take advantage of this opportunity, what happens is you get individual capitalists and factions of capitalism, both international factions and within nations, fighting against each other. And as you might imagine, they're not necessarily paying the price for that fight. So all of the trade wars that we're seeing, all of the international saber-rattling and contests between Chinese capitalism and American capitalism and European capitalism and Russian capitalism, these, threaten to escalate into actual warfare and into very serious consequences, economically speaking, for everyone on the planet. So capitalists increasingly have this very individualist view, which prevents them from actually realizing that the system is ultimately suicidal.
Wow, that's fascinating. So as I was saying earlier, you write how money and art, as they exist under capitalism, must be abolished. And I asked what is wrong with art under capitalism. So conversely, what negative impact can art have on money?
Well, there's two ways of answering that question. One of them is the negative impact that is maybe not a good thing, and the second is the type of negative impact that is a good thing. So not a good thing, I would say the negative impact of art on money is a little more poetic, and we have to go back to an earlier notion of art and the imagination from, again, the Renaissance or early modern capitalism, where terms like art and imagination were not these sort of lauded and celebrated ideas that they are today. They're actually seen as a form of deception, and this idea of art as a deception and as dangerous to society goes back to Plato, arguably before Plato. And it's the idea that really under capitalism, there's a little too much creativity in the capitalist economy, in the sense that, if you go down to Wall Street right now, you're going to find rooms in Goldman Sachs and Bank of America where people with PhDs in astrophysics are sitting around figuring out how to create new derivative contracts, figuring out how to build high-frequency trading machines, basically trying to compete with other financiers to game the system as best they can. So there's a kind of artfulness within capitalism that is allowing this phenomenon we call financialization to run amok, in the sense that, now this speculative force, which is, throwing money around the world and multiplying bets upon bets upon bets, is really skewing any way in which the prices of things, which is to say the actual monetary value of something, is connected to its underlying value. So just for very, very briefly, you're in Chicago, so all around Chicago there are warehouses full of raw materials, including foodstuffs and also things like aluminum, that are sitting there that may never be used, but the deeds to those resources are being traded multiple times on financial markets. So on the one hand, we can see that as a pathology of capitalism, but I prefer to see it as a way in which capitalism has mobilized the imagination, mobilized a certain kind of creativity, a certain artfulness, our kind of incredible human capacities to create things that we imagine beforehand, and put that towards the purposes of accumulating wealth for some. So that's the kind of bad side. The good side, I would say, about what how art can threaten or challenge capitalism is fundamentally art holds the space open for our imagination. It holds a space open that everywhere else in society has been foreclosed. There's not actually a lot of spaces left in our society to think about the system that we live in, to think about the deeper questions of society. The university, as we've spoken about in a previous interview, has been deeply, deeply commodified and financialized already. We no longer have, except for, of course, your show and several others, a kind of media that's willing to ask deep and profound questions and challenge power. There are very few spaces in our society to actually bring our imaginations outside of the sort of commodified and financialized realms that they've been habituated into by people who are basically trying to exploit or extort or extract value from us. And so art, even though it has, in fact, been highly commodified for its entire history and now financialized in profound ways, there's still something about the space that it has to hold open in our society that leaves a kind of room for the imagination and room for collective exercises of the imagination, especially when those artworks are experienced together and in public or are, used as workshops in order to harness and enliven the imagination of social movements.
Is neoliberalism then is the final goal of neoliberalism, whether it's an intended goal or an unintended consequence, to close all of those areas like art where neoliberalism can be challenged? Is the idea to close those spaces of potential challenge to neoliberalism?
In a way, although I would say I don't know if we could really say neoliberalism has a goal. It's a phenomenon that's driven by the contradictions and competition of capitalism as it reaches a very high rate of accumulation, and this sort of competition between capitalists who can't really help themselves from competing ruthlessly to outdo one another. But I think I would offer just a little correction to that, which is I think it doesn't. The problem with neoliberalism and financialization, which is different than I think other earlier moments of capitalism, is that ultimately it's not trying to close down the imagination. You can imagine that back in the 19th century, capitalists had no interest in the imagination of workers, and if workers' imaginations became too grand and they thought they perhaps deserved to be able not to starve, or that they deserved, for instance, to take over the means of production, that would be answered by brutal repressive force. Today, in this moment of capitalism, because it's so highly individualized and so highly based on individuals imagining themselves as competitive agents with one another and so deeply invested in consumerism, neoliberal financialization as a system, if we can say it wants something, what it wants is for all of us to reorient our imagination and creativity towards participation within the system. So it doesn't close down the imagination or creativity. It would be more accurate to say it puts it to work, and it encourages each of us to put it to work in the name of our own individual economic survival. What does this look like? Well, on the realm of work, it looks like this increasing encouragement that all of us should, throughout our entire lives, even since childhood, be cultivating a kind of curriculum vitae or a resume that includes hobbies, passions, skills, and that when it comes time to offer this at the workplace, we should arrive to basically be able to sell our labor power or our human capital, as it's been reframed by sort of neoliberal theologians, as an asset to be rented by our boss. And the second way that works is that just on the level of everyday life. I mean, some of us, like me, work in the sort of cultural field. I'm a teacher, so I am working with my imagination and with my mind. But anyone in the society, even if you're doing manual labor, has had to become vastly more creative and imaginative just in terms of how to make ends meet in an era when real wages adjusted for inflation are dropping and corporate profits are skyrocketing.
So, from your description earlier, it sounds like art is expanding the financial imagination under neoliberalism, yet one of the criticisms we've heard from a lot of analysts who have appeared on our show is that neoliberalism stagnates the political imagination. So why under neoliberalism can art expand the financial imagination, but is unable to expand the political imagination?
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, I think I would draw here on the late Mark Fisher's notion of capitalist realism, which is the strange way in which, under this moment of neoliberalism, after the so-called end of history, as announced by Francis Fukuyama in the early 90s, after the fall of the Berlin Wall and the collapse of the Soviet Union, there's a sense of absolute sort of fatalism about capitalism. It's here to stay, and all you can do is really kind of tinker around the edges or compete to survive within it. And I think that is a fundamental foreclosure of the political imagination, because it says, this system is unavoidable. Now, I would say that I actually think after the 2008 financial crisis, that end of history ideology has actually been challenged. It's been challenged, of course, from the left by social movements who are saying that we need to essentially have some version of socialism, which has always been the obvious answer on some level, although there are many different types of socialism one could propose. But I think, unfortunately, what we've seen in the last 2 or 3 years, or what we've been made aware of, is that also that consensus has been challenged from the right. And the right has essentially propounded and is in the project of developing neo-fascism as a dominant ideology. And that is still a capitalist ideology ultimately, but like all forms of fascism, it insists that the only way to save capitalism from its own pathologies is for a strong, centralized, usually ethno-nationalist or religious fundamentalist state to be kind of the supreme arbiter and the ultimate expression of force. So I think in this case we have a real horrific foreclosure of the political imagination. And this is where I think art becomes, in a weird way, so important, because we need to remember our powers. The success of fascism is to insist that our powers only stem from our obedience to an authoritarian master. And the success of capitalism as an ideology is to success that our powers, our creative powers as individuals and as a society, can only be fully expressed in the competitive landscape of the market. Well, there are and there have been other alternatives. And in fact, even just the experience of daily life shows us that our most creative, imaginative, and pleasurable moments come from collective experiences. It's not to discount the importance of individuals who are truly incredibly talented and gifted and can offer us great cultural treasures, whether it's in music or visual arts or dance or performance or literature. But it is to say that for those things to become treasured, they become treasured collectively. And they only have resonance when they resonate with larger audiences who are there to witness and to take them in and to allow it to transform them.
We are speaking with organizer and educator Max Haiven. He has a new book out, Art After Money, Money After Art, Creative Strategies Against Financialization. And I was just looking at my notes, Max, and I have like 60 pre-written questions. I've gotten through 2 so far because I keep having follow-ups like this one. So does neoliberalism then, this is something I kept thinking about when I was reading your book, does it make us all artists, and that is, I know the precarious life of, even prior to financialization, but even more recently, like in the 1990s, I know the precarious life of artists. I know how difficult their life can be, how they're basically a one-person shop that is completely vertically integrated. They're their distribution person, they're their marketing person, they're the people who create the content, and they have to go out essentially begging, trying to find work for themselves so they can sell their art, so they can sell their brand. How much does financialization make us all those kind of free agent artists?
I think to a very real extent. And there's one way that I'd really want to insist on that, and one way that I'd want to kind of challenge it. So I think almost 20 years ago now, the English cultural studies scholar Angela McRobbie pointed out that, in her words, artists had become the pioneers of the new economy, or were held up as the pioneers of the new economy, really against their will. And that, as you say, was precisely that in a moment when governments sort of were moving away from central sort of social democratic economic planning from the post-war period, or not social democratic, let's say Keynesian economic planning. And this was also sort of accompanied by the deindustrialization of the global north, and the movement of the kind of exploitation of industrial labor to the global south. There was this rhetoric of creativity, creative economies, creative cities, the creative class. And this really held up the figure of the artist, this kind of romantic, no strings attached, freewheeling arbitrageur of the self, as the icon that all workers were supposed to emulate. And there was this lionization of the figure of the artist as someone who navigates the field of capitalism without relying on like full-time permanent job, without relying on the paternalism of the nation state and the welfare state. And to a certain extent, that's just grown and grown and grown. And it's been tied into the kind of structural and cultural changes of financialization, such that, like all of these shows like The Voice or like American Idol, these are shows about artists who invest a huge amount, in secret usually, in their cultural capacities and their cultural capital, in their skills and talents, and then sort of go on the auction block, for lack of a better word, and try and get these bosses essentially to, laud them and skyrocket them into fame and fortune. But like those shows, the artistic field and almost every other field of the economy that we're seeing now is one where a large number of people compete for a very small number of opportunities, which allows some people to become kind of superstars and earn money and have economic stability and get glamour and fame and recognition, while the vast majority of people suffer in obscurity and end up being sandwich artists, which is what, Subway restaurants has the audacity to call their exploited employees. So on the one hand, I think that this idea of the artist as the pioneer of the new economy is absolutely true, and it's become more true recently. I think the one way that I would challenge it is to say that the vast majority of workers today never get any opportunity to express their creativity and imagination, and any claims that they do are kind of bogus. Like, sandwich artist is another good example. You can call this person an artist. You can talk about how, when your awful boss calls you in for the job interview at Subway, they want you to tell them that you're passionate about making sandwiches, that you love the public, that you're using this job to improve your human capital so you can go on and have a great career in a house and blah, 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 all the things you're supposed to want under capitalism. But the reality is they don't care. They want a human body with a minimal amount of cognitive function to stand there, assembling parts of a sandwich all day so that they can sell it for a profit and cultivate surplus value. So I want to insist that, yes, of course, this idea of the artist is still very dominant and very profound in the way that it's trying to restructure our imaginations to bring us into line with financialization and neoliberalism. But when we actually look at the reality of society, the vast majority of us are never going to get to express our creativity. We're never going to get rewarded for it. And the best we can say about most people's artistic activities under this system is that they help people stay alive and sane and retain some shred of humanity in very dehumanizing circumstances.
As Rebecca Solnit pointed out in her book Hollow Cities back in 1999, I think it was, that artists are the kind of bohemian pioneers who eventually end up gentrifying neighborhoods. And here we're talking about artists being the template for precarity and the type of job experience we now have under financialization. How much does the creative class cause the problems of financialization? How much is the creative class agents of financialization and neoliberalism, whether they want to admit it or whether they realize it or not?
Yeah, it's a great question. I mean, if we're going to talk about gentrification and the use of artists as sort of levers or vehicles to open up what were formerly poor, usually racialized neighborhoods for sort of investment and accumulation by dispossession, as David Harvey puts it, then I think we need to go back one step, because here we have to introduce the notions of race and class and gender, which also are tied up in the notion of the artist. I mean, it's not a coincidence that the idea that we have of the quintessential artist looks a lot like the reality of who, throughout capitalist history, has been the quintessential capitalist. They are typically white men, usually from Western Europe, but not exclusively, who are from elite backgrounds. That's who we associate typically with artists, although we have a certain notion since the Impressionists that they are sort of poor and sort of how do you say, like poor in a very romantic way, poor in a sort of glamorous way. But of course, throughout the actual history of capitalism, many of the artists, and especially the art collectors and art world, have been from the elite, and specifically, there have been the same people who've been running factories and managing colonies, and women have, until really the 20th century, been almost completely excluded from the realm of artists. So beginning from that position where the idea or ideal of the artist is really a member of the ruling class, we can now draw a cleaner line to how that ideal is being mobilized in this moment of financialized capitalism. So here we see that artists have become what some scholars have called the shock troops of gentrification. Shock troops are, those soldiers who are put out at the front of the army who are really meant to be slaughtered, but who are sort of so fanatical and driven that they can break through the front line of the enemy ranks. So this militarized metaphor seems quite accurate for what happens to artists, because these days, especially in the 20th century, many artists tend to live on the economic margins of society, even if they do come from positions of inherited wealth. They tend to be looking for large studio spaces in usually abandoned or semi-abandoned zones, or zones that are presumed to be abandoned by the kind of dominant sociocultural paradigm. And so they end up moving into neighborhoods where rent is cheap, or where wealthier people do not desire to live. And following them come the kind of yuppies who are attracted to the artists, who are attracted to the kind of culture and businesses that artists either start or that they sort of catalyze within a neighborhood. And slowly rents rise, the police start showing up, and the original inhabitants of the neighborhood, and eventually the artists themselves, get kind of pushed out of the way to make room essentially for people who are seeing the neighborhood as a source of investment, as a place to sink their money so that they can benefit from rising property prices in the future, whether they live in that neighborhood or not. This is just one of the ways in which art becomes a kind of a sort of tool for financialization, and artists become a tool for financialization. But there are others as well. I mean, for quite a long time, art has been a method for evading taxes or for laundering money. Investing in art and then donating art to a major museum or art gallery becomes a kind of tax-deductible donation for many extremely wealthy people. You can use art in various ways to move money around the world by moving art. You can sink your money into expensive works of art and store them in a free port, which is basically like a luxury warehouse attached to an airport with special rules around customs and duties and special legal designations. You can kind of put your art collection in these vaults for centuries and trade the rights to that art as a purely financial asset. There are companies now that specialize in pooling the assets of many investors and then hiring a bunch of art experts to basically buy a collection of art purely as a kind of portfolio for its future returns. and many other mechanisms for mobilizing art as a what used to be called an alternative asset class, but I think one that's becoming more and more central to the thinking and operations of many financiers and even financial institutions like banks.
Because you write in the last 15 years or so, astronomical records have been set, then broken for the hammer price of works by still living artists at the world's duopoly fine art auction houses, Sotheby's and Christie's. But this represents only a fraction of all the works sold in the notoriously murky, cronyistic, and one might even say deeply corrupt market for art. Can the art industry, can the art market corrupt finance?
In a certain extent, although I think finance is fundamentally corrupt, so it can't really be more corrupted. This is an industry that claims to, within the claims of neoliberals, the purpose of the financial services industry is to take deposits of people who have accumulated a lot of money and distribute it throughout the capitalist economy so that other enterprises can succeed. According to sort of neoliberal theology, what markets do is they properly allocate and assign the prices to assets by creating markets of buyers and sellers. So I won't go into what that means, except to say that within neoliberalism, there's a sort of a notion that ultimately the financial services industry is a good thing and is a kind of pure organ of capitalism, the capitalist body. But I think if we look historically, as we've spoken about in previous interviews, we can see that the financial services industry has always existed to facilitate, to normalize, and in many ways to hide or disguise horrific forms of exploitation and extraction of resources from people on the earth, starting with slavery and colonialism, for which the kind of signature institutions of finance were created. So I want to say on one hand that there is a way that this moment of financialization of the last 30 years has been really, in a way, changed by the kind of flights of the imagination and forms of kind of noxious creativity that financiers have been able to get away with in a moment when they're no longer being regulated by the state in any way a sufficient manner, and also in a way where social movements have been at a low point in the tide, and where essentially capitalists have no reason to fear that inequality will lead to their unseating. But I think ultimately I wouldn't call that art and creativity corrupting finance. I would just call that a changing relationship between the two. The two have always been related, and we shouldn't sort of mourn the passing of this notion of sort of autonomous, free, radical art that we think existed in the past and now has been corrupted. Likewise, we shouldn't mourn the passing of a kind of good and pure financial industry that has been corrupted by kind of the evil imaginations and machinations of sort of greedy individuals. Both art and money have always been embroiled within each other. They've been encrypted within each other, to use a terminology I use in the book. And the question for me is not how can art, as something that stands outside of finance and outside of capitalism, comment on capitalism and finance. The question instead for me is how can art, as something that has always been embroiled within finance and within capitalism, but that form of embroilment is changing, how can it comment on and reveal and challenge financialization and capitalism from within? So it's not an argument that art is somehow this kind of pure, beautiful thing that is, comes out of the romantic imagination, this sort of spark from God. It's really saying this thing has always emerged within and evolved out of capitalism, and so maybe it has something to teach us about the system that has given birth to it.
So, but we always want to have this romantic notion that money and art are kind of anathema to one another. So why do we embrace that idea of that romantic idea of art and money being separate from one another, if in reality we can easily see that they have always gone hand in hand? Why do we have this romantic notion, or why do we even want to have that romantic notion?
Well, I think I'd say there's maybe three reasons I'd mention, and there are more. One of them is that romantic notion of the artist is precisely what guarantees art its financial value. That is what capitalists want to buy. They don't want to buy, Study in Blue number 36. They want to buy a Gerhard Richter. They want to buy a Andy Warhol. They want to buy Damien Hirst. They refer to these pieces, these commodities that they're speculating on, by the name of the artist, because the name of the artist as this kind of romantic figure guarantees the value of the work. It's not just a canvas. It is something associated with the signature of the artist. It's a very strange form of magic. The second thing I would say is I think this romantic idea of the artist still functions in part because our society has become so individualized. So in previous centuries, in previous decades, where society has not been so completely atomized by neoliberalism, the figure of the artist has been seen as a distrustful figure, as a radical figure, as a provocative figure, or as a figure of moral degeneracy. In a moment of hyper-individualism, we are all encouraged to think of ourselves as if we could, in a weird way, be artists, even if we don't have any artistic talent, or don't believe we have any artistic talent, and even if we are working in, as a sandwich artist. There's this sense that the artist holds the place for a kind of valorized or glamorized individual actor in our society that we're all supposed to want to be or to become. Someone who's free, someone whose imagination gets to play, someone who's romantic and passionate, all of the things that we're told we're supposed to want to be in a highly individualized society. And the final thing I'll say about it is we fetishize the artist and the idea of art as we've understood it precisely so that we don't have to witness or own the incredible damage that has been done to us as social, collective, and creative beings. What capitalism has done over the last 30 years to the soul, for lack of a better term, and I'll use that term in the way that Franco Bifo Berardi uses it, as, not this kind of thing that's given by God, not this metaphysical instance, but this sort of passionate dimension of our material existence. That has been incredibly damaged by this system. It's been damaged by decades of exploitation, decades of individualism, decades of being replaced with this kind of competitive drive. To the extent that we can still believe in the myths of art and the artist, we can look away from the rot that is not only occurring within our society as a whole, but within each of us, which is precisely that when the thing we call art and when creativity and the imagination function as perhaps would be a more healthy way in a society where everyone had everything they needed to thrive and to contribute, which is to say a society that was based on perhaps socialist or anarchist principles, where everyone can thrive and contribute as they should, then, and only then, I think, do creativity and the imagination get to live their full life. Under the system that we have now, where our cooperative and our commoning impulses are subordinated and transformed into competition, distrust, fear, and scarcity, these things are fragments and fractured versions of what they could be. And that is a very difficult thing for any of us to look at, both as a society and as an individual. And so instead of looking at that, and as we should, getting very angry about what's been done to us, and then working together to transform that situation, instead, we sort of look towards art and the artist as this fetishized realm where at least we know that this person is getting to live this wonderful life of glamour and recognition and creativity and passion and pleasure. And as long as they exist out there, the rest of us schlubs can make do.
So the starving artist legitimizes the one who's making $100,000 a painting.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. I mean, Gregory Shillette is a great commentator on this, and he talks about dark matter. He describes this as dark matter. So, in the night sky, when we look up at space, there's stars, and the stars are indeed brilliant, and they're, burning nuclear reactors that, have incredible gravity and weight, and they're beautiful. And that's the same in the art world. There are these stars, and many of them are extremely talented. But what is in between? And if you look at the whole density of space, of course, the stars make up less than a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of 1%. There's a huge amount of dark matter out there, which, is this what Shillette borrows from the sort of astrophysics, is this missing mass out there. And that is all of the people who are struggling, those people who are hobbyists, who are creators, who are fans, who are making art in the hopes of being recognized but are never going to be recognized, who are people who are throwing their artistic and creative and imaginative passions into things that they are not actually rewarded by. For instance, people who are, basically like go to work every day and come up with new ideas for their boss so their boss can make more money, but who are never going to have that work recognized. So there's this massive amount of creative and imaginative labor going on in our society that doesn't get called art, that doesn't get included in the art economy, and it's only on the basis of that huge pyramid of energies that the stone at the very top of the pyramid, which are those kind of art stars, to mix a metaphor here, really gets to shine so brightly. And then their work, of course, becomes the assets to be managed, leveraged, and speculated upon by the proverbial 1%.
And then the rest of us starve doing radio shows like this. Just a couple more questions for you, Max. You write, we need to pay close attention to the way the entire field of contemporary art is embroiled in this game. Not only the auction houses, art dealers, and mega museums, but also the whole global art production chain, independent galleries, art schools, art writers and critics, even artists themselves. Financialized money trickles down unevenly and unfairly and influences all art world spaces in some way, even spaces that are avowedly independent and allegedly radical. So is the art industry then an unspoken welfare system that rewards white rich people institutionally and not only publicly but privately as well? Is art another institution of white privilege?
I mean, certainly that is the material reality of it for a large part. I mean, if you look at the vast majority of art stars, those people, that's the sort of proverbial 1% of the art world, and pretty much if you do a survey, and a great group from New York has done this survey called BFA, MFA, PhD. They've actually done a survey of artists in New York. There's other groups around the world that have done this sort of artist inquiry as well. You do find that the ability to thrive and succeed as an artist is highly correlated to your level of socioeconomic and cultural privilege. And I think that in of itself, one of the struggles about writing a book about art and the art market is, as you can probably already tell, I don't particularly care what happens to the art market, and I'm not super sympathetic to artists. I'm more interested in what this can tell us about capitalism as a whole. And I think for artists who are concerned about art and the art market, they should be concerned with joining others and trying to abolish that system. But in the interests of talking about what art can teach us, I think this question about artists and their relative privilege is very important, because what it shows us is that the art market would like to imagine itself as a pure meritocracy, like the rest of capitalism. It has to kind of build this myth that it rewards talent, for lack of a better term, blindly. That an art collector, an art gallerist, an art system, they know great work when they see it, and they're going to reward it. But what you in fact see is that the people who can survive and thrive within the art market and the art world are often people who come from very privileged backgrounds, and that privilege tends to correlate highly to access to whiteness, to being a man, to coming from a sort of upper class background. And that means that what gets still, to this day, what gets taken to be these signature works of cultural contribution to our society and culture is disproportionately the work of, sort of white, wealthy men. And that, in turn, reaffirms a kind of mythology of white supremacy and patriarchal notions of creativity, imagination, and capacity that are, of course, still normalized within the rest of the economy. So there's a kind of vicious circle between the art world and other spheres of our society in terms of reproducing these very pernicious mythologies.
Go ahead.
Yeah. No. That's
one last question for you then, Max. We've been speaking with organizer and educator Max Haiven, author of Art After Money, Money After Art, Creative Strategies Against Financialization. Find out more about Max at maxhaiven.com. That's HAIVEN.com. And you can follow him on Twitter at Max Haiven. Again, you can go to thisishell.com, listen to our interviews and our talks with Max from the past in 2016 and 2017. 2016 when we talked with him about the undercommoning, and 2017 when we discussed reactionary authoritarianism. You can find both those interviews at thisishell.com. Max is assistant professor and Canada Research Chair in Culture, Media, and Social Justice at Lakehead University in Thunder Bay, and director of the Reimagining Value Action Lab He's the co-director of the Radical Imagination Project, which you can find out more about at radicalimagination.org. One last question for you, and as always, it's our question from hell, the question we hate to ask, you might hate to answer. Our audience is going to hate your response. You write that money and art, in fact, hold one another up, so to speak, to mutually reinforce one another as institutions of capitalism amidst that system's crises and contradictions. Can capitalism exist without art?
That is a good question. No, it can't, in the sense that capitalism needs to, and increasingly needs to, co-opt, constrain, and harness all human capacities, especially as the sort of cycles of accumulation manifest in what we now call neoliberalism and financialization. It needs to claim more and more of the energies that we, as humans, are predisposed to expressing. And what we call art is the foreclosure or the container in which we put those passions and energies that we associate with the terms creativity and imagination. So art is needed because it's a box within capitalism where we dump a bunch of stuff that we don't want. Well, we do want it, but capitalists don't want it infecting the rest of the economy. If we actually got to express our creativity and imagination in terms of how we organize society, that's a form of socialism or anarchism. That's not capitalism. In capitalism, only a few people ever get to do that. So essentially, capitalism does need art. Previous moments of capitalism have needed art in different ways. They've needed art to help reproduce the capitalist class, to give capitalists a reason to go to the opera and hobnob with one another, to give capitalists art schools to send their children to give capitalists assets that they can buy and admire, and in admiring the artwork that they bought, admire themselves in a kind of narcissistic fashion for their wisdom and benevolence and cultural largesse. So at various moments in capitalism, capitalism has always needed art. That said, it doesn't need art as much as it needs a lot of other things, like, for instance, money or like labor. If all artists went on strike, and there have been efforts to do this, it would not immediately bring the collapse of the capitalist system. What would be much more effective, however, is if artists went on strike as part of, let's say, a global creativity and imaginative strike, which is to say everyone who labors would strike, a general strike of a whole population, to say that we will no longer stand for our creativity, imagination, passion, and pleasure to be constrained and exploited by this system. And that's the point where I think art has some leverage. It's not so much about it as this distinct field where you go and you see this nice object in a gallery. It has to do with the place that it holds in our imagination for the things that we truly want to animate our society, but which are today denied to so many of us and denied to the kind of structure of the system as a whole.
Max, it has been a pleasure talking to you again. Enjoy the rest of your weekend on the shores of Lake Gitchagumi. I really appreciate you being back on our show, and I'll be bugging you again to have you return once more to This Is Hell.
It's always a pleasure.
You've been listening to a This Is Hell interview. For more interview hell and to support the show, visit thisishell.com.